Hi, good morning everybody. I'm very happy to be here today. Quite interesting that Niels is here because he was kind of present when my career took two turns. The first, unlike David, who kind of his mid-career crisis came in the mid-career after getting tenure. Mine was a mid-career crisis in the very early stages of my career after finishing my PhD, and I had very little sense of what I was going to do next. I had ideas, but not actually anything concrete that I wanted to do. And then I got invited in 2005 to, I think it was the first meeting of disaggregating the study of civil war in Zurich, which was kind of an interesting experience and drove me more deeply to expand my work on ADM and trying to ask the question of how can one verify or actually ground first and then verify that patterns that are emerging in computer simulation hold any value in the real world. That was the first occasion, and I started working on that and slowly getting more and more into exploring processes of the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, etc. And in 2009, I organized a workshop here at Hebrew University with some colleagues from abroad. And Niels was here also. Sorry, Niels, that I'm doing this to you. And we had a tour, one of those variations of tours like the one you took yesterday, and brought us at some point to the wall in Abu Dis. And I remember that walking around the wall, Niels asked me, so why don't you study Jerusalem? And it's strong because I never thought that I would study Jerusalem, but I started to study Jerusalem at that point, and we ended up writing a paper with some co-authors, doing something very similar. And this is the paper that Niels mentioned before, which was basically a computer simulation of Jerusalem and trying to post-date incidents of death during the Second Intifada in order to predict what are the consequences of spatial rearrangement of the city. So that was published in 2014, and ever since I kept on working on Jerusalem and getting more deeply into spatial aspects of violence in Jerusalem. And what I want to talk to you briefly today and mainly show you is this paper that was recently published in Political Geography, and the title is back there. It's a piece that was co-authored with Jonathan Rokem and Chagai Weiss. So the notion is, how do you make sense of this, right? But not just these pictures, it's how do you make sense of the variation that exists in the location these events take place. If you go around and ask people where do most of the events take place, they will tell you in the old city. And yeah, bulk of the violence, or a serious bulk of the violence takes place in the old city and around the old city. But there is a lot of violence that takes place in other parts of Jerusalem. And there are zones in Jerusalem and East Jerusalem that are relatively non-violent. So the idea was to try, or one of the ideas in this paper is to try and make sense of that. And furthermore, to see if elements of patterns of intergroup violence can be understood as an issue of connectivity and mobility. Specifically, we wanted to see whether there are different types of violence that are connected to mobility and connectivity, while others are not. In that regard, specifically, we wanted to study incidents of individually perpetrated violence. So, while imagine an individual ramming pedestrians with a car, or somebody using a knife and stabbing somebody else, as opposed to incidents of more of a collective violence, which are related to stone throwing, Molotov cocktails on occasions, etc., etc. So those are the two types of that we wanted to examine, and to ask whether or not there are any lessons that can be drawn beyond the context of Jerusalem. The idea of connective location is really straightforward. Perpetrating violence requires, at least in our mind, and the literature suggests, an element of mobility. You need to get to the place. So connectivity is an important factor in that. There are areas in space that can create more opportunities for this type of events. We're going to see one of those in a minute. There may be strategic locations that also carry some symbolic values that will be more attractive to perpetrators as opposed to others. And there may be a diverging logic for this, or divergent spatial logic to these types of violence, and that is represented by the two hypotheses in the back. So I want to apologize. This is going to be a bit like normal science, social science type of presentation. I forgot there are hypotheses, etc. There's going to be a regression table also. So in our mind, individual perpetrators need more than others to connect, to get to a place. Collective incidents of violence are less likely to occur, or less likely to rely heavily on connectivity and on mobility in order to get to a certain place. Why Jerusalem? Well, I think it's kind of obvious, but it's a complicated space. It's highly segregated in residential terms. There are different transportation systems in East and West Jerusalem. There is an ongoing disagreement about the boundaries of the space, and it breeds a lot of violence over the years. There are other good reasons to speak about Jerusalem, and I'm happy to elaborate later, but I really want to leave some time for Q&A, so I'm not going to go. And then Nir will present after me, and he probably is much better at explaining why Jerusalem in this context. So what we did in order to study the question was to rely, first of all, on crowdsourced data on Palestinian violence. And Palestinian violence, because it's less institutionalized than Israeli violence, so it occurs more sporadically in space and in other forms than the institutionalized violence perpetrated by Israel usually. We collected data on a period from August 2014, which is immediately after the kidnapping and burning and murder of the teenage Muhammad Abu Khadr that occurred in July 2014 and instigated a big wave of violence in the city, and all through the end of 2016. Overall, we recorded 2,487 incidents, a relatively small share where incidents involving individual perpetrators. Those usually get a lot of exposure. Everybody have heard about knifing and stabbings, etc. Incidents of stone throwing are less recorded usually, but they do appear once you use crowdsourced data in order to get that information. We use a technique called space syntax in order to identify the most connected and accessible paths in space. And I'm going to show you a map in a second, but there is the idea that You can use techniques in which you can identify locations within a certain radius that are the most connected to other locations, the most accessible to other locations. And if connectivity is an issue, we would anticipate that those are the places that will be most fertile for violence. And lastly, we, after showing everything in maps, and I'm going to show you in a second, we also ran like a more conventional statistical analysis using a grid. So we divided the space of Jerusalem into 531 cells. Each cell receive a connectivity code, a score, and we were able to assess whether or not the likelihood of events increases in the most connected cells. So this is like the first map that I want to show you. The green circles are incidents of collective violence, again, rioting, and so on. The red dots are incidents of individually perpetrated violence. The gray areas, paths, and the green path over here are the 5% most connected roads in the city. In this part, many of the individually perpetrated events occur within that structure. You're going to see that overall here it's the Bar-Lev way. It's also the path of the Jerusalem light rail system. So there is an element that already visually we consider there is an element of connectivity that explains or that seems to be associated with the individually perpetrated events, but not necessarily, or I would say not at all, with the collectively perpetrated events that seem to be spread all over the city. Obviously, the old city is the epicenter of all events, but this is kind of almost obvious. This is the path of the light rail. Most of the events, of the individually perpetrated events, occurred within 800 meters, or 10 minutes walk from the light rail. Just to be precise, we're not claiming a causation here, because we don't have the data to study that. Whether or not there was a change in the distribution of events from the period prior to the erection of the light rail to the period after, that's something that we're curious about, but we haven't studied yet. Just a quick table with some other covariates. We repeated the space syntax with different radii, and what we can actually see quite clearly here is that connectivity explains incidents of individually perpetrated and somewhat, and it's positively, interestingly, of course, it's negatively associated with incidents of collective violence. I would have liked to see non-significant, but that's what we have here, or actually in line with what we expected, but still. Violence is less likely in Jewish segments, so most of the violence concentrates in areas of East Jerusalem, and most of collective violence, of individually perpetrated collective violence, is also concentrated very close to the Jerusalem light rail. So here are some conclusions. I think we found what we were looking for. The geographies of urban intergroup violence should be understood as an issue of connectivity and mobility in space. Different types of
forms of violence manifest themselves differently and are driven by geospatial factors. I think if you're interested and want to read the paper, I think we demonstrated that space syntax is a very useful way of actually deriving meaning in an urban setting and identify more, let's call it, inflammable spaces. I think that our ability to take these lessons and go beyond Jerusalem is quite limited. Jerusalem has some very unique characteristics that it's not quite clear how generalizable are our conclusions beyond the fact that we can use space syntax to study other spaces. Thank you.